Good afternoon, everyone. If you could please take your seat, we're going to get started with this next panel. My name is Sarah Bohn, and I'm a research fellow at PPIC, and I'm very pleased to introduce this panel discussion about economic shifts and their implications for California's future. The panel will feature leaders in business, government, and philanthropy. Our economy has been through turmoil over the past 7 years, as we all know, and we've made substantial progress in reversing it. California has grown jobs at twice the national rate over the last 3 years. And as of June of 2014, this year, we hit a historic milestone of having recovered all of the 1.3 million jobs lost during the Great Recession. Our unemployment rate, currently at about 7.3%, is falling faster than the US unemployment rate. Furthermore, the construction industry is growing the fastest out of all industries in the state in terms of job growth, which is great news about a rebounding housing market. These are all signs that though the recovery has been slow, some say anemic, California is certainly catching up. On the other hand, which you knew coming from an economist was going to happen, by many measures, we're only back to where we were 7 years ago. Yes, though our state unemployment rate is dropping fast, we're still only at roughly 2008 levels. And yes, although we've recovered all the jobs lost during the Great Recession, that's actually not a fast enough rate of job growth to keep up with our growing labor force. And except for a few service industries, like in science and technology and healthcare, which have created 60% of the new jobs in the recovery, no other industry in the state, even construction, is back to pre-recession levels of employment. And as we all know, California is large and diverse, so these statewide economic facts only tell part of the story, perhaps a small part of the story. In some regions, and for some families in the state, economic circumstances are falling behind where they were before the recession started. Many regions of California are close to recovering the jobs that were lost during the recession. In fact, the Silicon Valley and San Francisco are well above that, having added twice as many jobs lost during the recession. But Sacramento has only recovered 70% of the jobs lost, and Los Angeles and Riverside metro areas are only slightly better, having recovered about 80 to 85% of the jobs that were lost. So given that most regions are barely back to where they were in 2007, it's not surprising that we don't see much evidence that the large share of people who stopped looking for work during the recession have returned to the labor force. A full 17% of Californians are either unemployed, underemployed, or have stopped looking for work. So as a result, even though we have grown jobs and lowered the unemployment rate, family incomes have yet to rebound much. The middle family in California earned only 90% of what they did before the Great Recession. Because the trend over the business cycles of the last 3 to 4 decades has been that high-income families recover more quickly and low-income families tend to lag behind, the gap between high and low incomes in California has soared in recent years. Even in regions that can be characterized as thriving, based on some indicators, their economic circumstances of families in those regions vary widely. Poverty rates under our new measure that accounts for the cost of living are actually highest in coastal California. Though these regions are thought of as affluent and certainly have economic engines that are creating many jobs, housing costs and other factors contribute to great disparities in economic circumstances across our population. Creating broad-based economic opportunity and mobility in California is really key to our future, both for families and for businesses in the state. And before turning the discussion over to our panel, I'd like to reinforce the importance of a skilled workforce in creating this type of opportunity and mobility that previous panels have touched on. We talk about the need to create jobs in California, and the question I'd like to raise are what type of jobs are being created, and are Californians prepared to fill them? By 2020, nearly 70% of new jobs in the state will require education beyond high school. Currently, only 66% of our workforce has that level of training, and that percentage is actually projected to fall slightly over the near term. Our skilled workforce has traditionally been a draw for business to California, and education has been a buffer for families during the booms and busts of our economic cycles. But PPIC estimates suggest that the skills of our future workforce are likely to fall short, leaving opportunities for the economy and for Californians on the table. In this way, leadership in the realm of education policy can play a pivotal role in shaping our shared economic future. Now I'd like to turn the conversation over to our distinguished panel to discuss these and other policy matters shaping our future economy. John Diaz is our moderator for this discussion. John has been editorial page editor for the San Francisco Chronicle since 1996. He has won numerous state and national awards and served as a juror for the Pulitzer Prize in 2001 and 2002. Earlier in his career, he worked for the Associated Press in Philadelphia, for the Denver Post, and for the Red Bluff Daily News. Thank you for being here today, and we look forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction as well as the overview. Unlike John Myers, while I have a very distinguished panel, I don't think any of you have gubernatorial ambitions I know of, so I should have an easier time as moderator. Well, I think Joe's going the other direction, so from the state legislature. Let me introduce him real quickly. There's fuller bios in your program. Allan Zaremberg, who many of you know, is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Cal Chamber. Before joining the Chamber, Allan served as Chief Legislative Advisor to and advocate for Governors George Deukmejian and Pete Wilson. You probably know or could have guessed that Allan has a law degree, but you may not know that he served as a captain and flight navigator for a KC-135 jet air refueling tanker while in the U.S. Air Force. Probably not bad practice for dealing with the legislature. Welcome, Allan Zaremberg. Antonia Hernández is President and CEO of the California Community Foundation. She has had a number of distinctions, serves on a lot of boards, basically including the Commission on the Presidential Debates, the Los Angeles 2020 Commission, the JFK Library Foundation Profile and Courage Award Committee, UCLA Board of Advisors, and I could go on, but please welcome Antonia Hernández. Now, Joe Simitian is a Santa Clara County Supervisor, but many of you may know him from his tenure here in the legislature, where he served both in the Assembly and the Senate. In fact, the California Journal, don't we miss that publication, actually identified Joe among the top 10 of his class during his first term in the legislature. Later in his tenure, the Capital Weekly named Joe one of the half-dozen most effective members of the legislature. So let me stipulate that all three of these attorneys are well qualified to talk about the California economy. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me start with a big picture question that has been touched on in some of the panels earlier today. It was not so long ago that you had national writers coming in from across the country talking about, and commentators talking about sort of the end of the California dream. In fact, it wasn't so long ago, and when Mitt Romney at the Republican convention made a California punchline talking about California and Greece. Well, as Sarah outlined in the program, things are a lot different today than what they have been, particularly coming out of the Great Recession. I was really struck when we had a PPIC event in San Francisco 3 years ago. You know, Nancy McFadden talked about California being the state of the haves and the have-not, and that being a concern. I was struck by a PPIC poll that had 39% of Californians consider themselves the haves, 49% have-nots. Well, let me ask you, a lot has happened in those last 3 years. Let me toss out this question to our panel. Is the California dream back? Allan, we'll start with you.
Well, I don't think the California dream ever left. You know, and especially for part of our state. So, you know, the election probably would have been a lot more exciting if Tim Draper had gotten his initiative to divide California into 5 or 6 states had been on the ballot. You know, it got a lot of national attention and it didn't have enough signatures to qualify. You know, I don't know if California is 5 or 6 states, but it's at least 2. And, you know, there's that area that's from the coast to 30 miles inland, and whether you're in San Francisco or Santa Clara, or you're San Diego or West Side LA, you know, is a heck of a lot different than certain parts of the valley, certain parts of the Inland Empire. It's different. And, you know, I think there are things you can look at that you say that are different that bring common threads to this. You know, if you do a circle around all the research universities in California, whether it be Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, UC San Diego, the economy is thriving. Jobs are growing around there to meet the needs, and the talent is there to meet the jobs that want to be there. And so when you draw that circle around there, you look there, those economies are doing great. And it's a common thread that I think we can look at and say, notwithstanding the fact that everybody's not going to go to college and be an engineer or a computer scientist or a biophysicist. But there are dreams that are being fulfilled every day in those parts of California because you have an educated workforce that matches up with a high wealth, high paying job. And that for many people was, I think, when people talk to the California dream, a chance to move up in life. And I think that still exists. You know, one of the things that I think you have to measure success, you go back, I always find, I don't know if a lot of economists agree with me on this, but you know, you say we haven't achieved the jobs that we had in 2007. Well, in my opinion, the jobs we had in 2007 were based on an economy that was artificially inflated by our housing boom, by a stock market. People had disposable income to buy cars, to send their kids to college, to go on vacation. That was due to a housing market that burst. It burst not just here, but around the globe. And so to just measure success, to come back to where we were with 2007, I don't think is a good metric because that was artificial. It wasn't sustainable. And so what we have today and what we need to have is a sustainable economy in California. And if we can do that, we have to match up that education opportunities for those parts of the state that aren't necessarily around those universities and match those up with the jobs. And I think for those people, that's where the dream may be still out in the future. And we have to find a way to get that done.
This is probably a very good setup because Antonia, with your foundation, and Joe, with your constituents in Santa Clara County, represent some very different aspects of what we're seeing. What's your perspective, Antonia, on the California
Well, you know,
dream?
the interesting thing is that the California dream is still a dream. And the reality of it is that we have the haves and we have the have-nots. And so when you ask the question about the California dream, for those who have achieved it, who live around a university, it's a wonderful thing. But you know, we have the haves and the have-nots. And I think a dream is an aspiration. And the question for us is, are we willing to work together to make that dream a reality for the vast majority of the population and not just for a few? And in many ways, I think the key to the future is, number one, education is key. From, you know, pre-K throughout the whole system. And many jobs of the future are not going to require a bachelor's degree. They will require a high school degree and a community college, combining the academic with the practical. Whether it's nursing, in technology, a lot of these jobs don't require that. But what they do require is an excellent education. And that's where we're failing. And I think that the three things that we need to really focus on is improving our educational system, and you know, the significant defunding of education during the recession. We have a long ways to go. We need to focus on community colleges. The UCs are critical. I'm a product of the UC. I think they're fantastic. But you know, the backbone of California is community colleges in the CalSTI system. That's where the majority of our students get their education. We have to focus on that. The other thing that we talk about is jobs. Well, you know, a lot of our jobs are service jobs. And whether you're working, and I'm not picking on companies, but I will name companies. You know, if you're working for Walmart, if you're working for a lot of the service industry, we need to raise the minimum wage, because at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're subsidizing those workers because of the safety net and what we provide them. And what an individual needs to achieve the California dream is a good paying job that allows them to sustain themselves and their family. And right now, they don't do that. And I know what's going to come back, that we lose jobs and we, chase away, industry. We chase away industry because of the bureaucracy that we need to deal with, unnecessary regulations that we need to address. And the fact of the matter is that we do have a mismatch, and we have to educate our workforce. Because increasing the service industry at minimum wages will not achieve the California dream.
Well, the question I have is, do I get to be the tie-breaking vote on minimum wage on the panel? Allan doesn't seem to be nodding in that direction.
I haven't voted yet.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm going to indulge in a couple of personal observations, because the setups have been spot on, I think, in terms of the technical side of the conversation. But on my father's side, my grandparents fled the genocide in Armenia and came to New York and met and married and struggled through the Depression. They had a 2-room tailor shop. At the end of the day, the shade would come down in the front, and Dad and Grandpa would get the cots out and they'd sleep in the front. Grandma and Aunt Virginia slept in the back, and that was the place where they lived and worked. That was 2 generations ago in my family. My father was able to go to college on the GI Bill and become a public school teacher. And then, because this was a day and age when a public school teacher could, on a single salary, buy a home in Palo Alto, California.
Whoa.
I'm not that old. That meant I got to have a first-rate public education, as did my buddy Gary Fazzino, whose father was a mechanic and had a second job as a clerk at a liquor store, as I recall. We went to school as well with Joy Miklas, who was the daughter of Mick, the custodian at our high school. And in our class was a young woman named Mary Hewlett, who was the daughter of Bill Hewlett, who was the CEO and president of Hewlett-Packard. And none of us thought that that was an odd combination of kids going to the same public school in the same economically diverse suburban community. It wasn't particularly racially or ethnically diverse, but it was economically diverse. And I think those opportunities, the one that my father had with the GI Bill, the one that I had that allowed me to go to a good public school system, even though I came from a relatively modest home, are fewer and fewer. And I come from a county that is now at 5.2% unemployment. The district that I represent is more in the 3% category, believe it or not. But when I look beyond those numbers, as Sarah suggested we should earlier, there's a footnote to that happy story. And the footnote is that if you look at the experience of white and Asian residents, it's different than Black and Latino residents. If you look at the changing numbers in terms of income inequality, the divide has gotten greater even as we have become more prosperous in the county that I represent. So I think that the California dream is still there, but I think it is tenuous at best. And the one other thing I would say before I hand the microphone back, John, is I do think it's important that as much as we may think of ourselves as a nation state, we remember that the fortunes of California are tied to our national fortunes as well. It is an American dream, we hope, that is sort of writ large. The California dream is a subset of that, but let's not think that we get to shape our own destiny without more than a little consideration to what happens nationally and internationally in terms of the dream still being alive in California.
You know, I think this is important because we talk about, this income inequality, which I certainly don't disagree with at all. But I think we have to keep focused on the fact that there's a growing disparity because there's part of California that is at the high end, and that part is growing. You just saw today, if you read the LA Times, reported that Google is expanding in Playa del Rey. I mean, there are people who have a robust business that they want to have in California. That's part of the dream. And there are people throughout the world who want to be in the employment of Google. They strive for that. That's their goal when they go to college. We don't want to interfere in that. I think that's the important aspect of when we have this discussion, is we want to make sure we produce the people from the university level that might be best for that have innovation, that we foster that and we don't stifle that as we look for ways for and as I talked about this, that we try to fulfill the dream for people who aren't there in those, and it starts with education and you're right, at the lowest level, because you're not going to get a college degree. But that's only part, the chain's only as good as the weakest link. There aren't enough slots. I mean, people lament the fact that say, well, why do these people end up with a huge debt and go to a for-profit school? Well, they need to go somewhere. There aren't enough slots in UC. CSU has a graduation rate, I believe, I was told by them, of 56%. People come out of there with debt, and there aren't enough slots to educate everybody, and we need to make sure we focus on that and make it a priority to make that dream. But don't stifle those industries that are in your community that are doing well, because in the name of saying we need to reduce income inequality. We need to promote.
I think we need to distinguish between income inequality and the question of opportunity. I got to tell you, I represent Palo Alto, Los Altos Hills, Saratoga, Cupertino, Mountain View, portions of Sunnyvale, small piece of San Jose, and frankly, everyone is delighted to see that success. My district is not about class warfare. They have no interest in that. But they want to make sure that while they're seeing that success, there is opportunity for the folks on the lowest rung. And so I think, frankly, people are more troubled not by what we might characterize as income inequality, but by the lack of opportunity. And the question, and it's a cliche, but it's an apt one, I think, is, has it become harder to climb the ladder of success as the rungs have become farther and farther apart? And that's really what's driving it. It's not about income inequality, it's about lack of opportunity for folks who are not yet at the top of that ladder.
And the key to that is, it is lack of opportunity. And the fact of the matter is that people are feeling that it's not a fair playing field. And as Californians, the key question for us, are we willing to invest in our public education system? Are we willing to invest in educating these individuals? And if we are, then I think we found solutions. But if we're not willing to invest, and it's an interesting thing, the income inequality, the rich get richer, wonderful, but the poor get poorer. We are a country and a state where it's a state of mind that we offer equal opportunity, that is a fair playing field, and that we invest in everyone. And the key question for California is, are we willing to invest as taxpayers? I work for a foundation, and the interesting thing about working for a foundation, and people say it's a wonderful thing, you're giving out money, it's a horrible thing, because the need is so great. And philanthropy cannot be that. We are the venture capital for interesting things. The investment comes from the public sector. That's where the money is. And we need to partner with the public sector to make things more effective. But we cannot be a thriving California if the statistics are lopsided. The few wealthy cannot live in a place where the majority are barely struggling to make a living.
Let me drill down a little more on this, because it really goes to the question of, are we really a state, or as Allan said, presumably jokingly, that we'd be maybe better off with a number of states. But how do these problems in terms of addressing opportunity and inequality, what role does the state have? Because Antonia, you mentioned the minimum wage. Well, a minimum wage in San Francisco, which has just been raised, where it's going to escalate up to $15 an hour, is much different than a minimum wage in Imperial County, for instance, or Shasta County. And yet, and again, with education, we talk about investing in education. Well, the governor, in giving more local control, the Palo Alto schools have been good for as long as anyone can remember, and will probably be just fine for the foreseeable future. But there are a lot of schools in California that are not working. Does this almost defy a state solution?
No, it doesn't. But first of all, one of the things that's great about being back home now at Santa Clara County is for the first time in more than a decade, I get to blame those people in Sacramento. So that's just a wonderful, it's always, after being those people for all those years. But you know, I agree entirely with Antonia about the importance of public education, but look, we've been having this conversation for 20 years. It's not like this is a new idea, and it's certainly been a recurrent theme in today's conversations, that the key to our success is a highly educated community. And the business community has been front and center in making that case. When I sat down with 30 CEOs in my district a decade ago, and at the end of the conversation, John Chambers from Cisco, who was leading the conversation, said, "What's the one thing you want these folks in Sacramento to concentrate on?" They could have said housing and transportation, which had come up a lot. They could have said business climate, which had come up during the conversation. But 3/4 of them, as we went around the room, said education. So we know that that's key, and yet we've been on the roller coaster ride of funding. And I would say that one of the things that has stifled us is we've had two different points of view, which I think are both wide of the mark. There's the, it's not about money. If you just use the money you have, it would, more wisely, you'd get good results. Well, I don't happen to think that's true. And I don't know anyone who says, give me less money and I'll do a better job. On the other hand, we got a group of folks who say, no, just give us more money, but we're not really all that interested in accountability. And frankly, continuing to spend more without some accountability isn't going to get it done. So I'm in the camp of more funding coupled with accountability, because that's the only path towards the success that all of us are sort of hoping to see. But trying to get the parties to come to the table instead of doing this and acknowledging, we'll put another buck on the table, but we'll put another buck on the table if it's coupled with meaningful accountability so we know we're getting the job done. That's a very hard conversation to have here in Sacramento, and it's a hard conversation to have right down at the local school board level in 1,000 school districts throughout the state. Until that happens, we aren't going to see a workforce that is truly prepared for 21st century jobs, and we're going to continue to have the circumstance we have in my area where people say, yes, we have high unemployment, or did, but we can't find people to fill the jobs. I mean, when CEOs are telling me in the midst of a recession they can't find people to fill jobs, you have to ask, well, what's wrong with that picture? And the obvious answer is, we're not educating a group of potential employees to meet the needs of the business community in the 21st century. And as I say, this is not a new conversation. So the question is, are we going to get serious about it instead of being on the roller coaster ride? And are we going to couple money and accountability together?
Do you see those education decisions, and Allan, we talked about this earlier this week. I mean, part of the problem is pure numbers, but also are we training the workforce with the types of education that's needed for these knowledge economy jobs? Certainly, Jerry Brown, the governor, is getting a lot of frustration in his attempt to get more efficiency and accountability out of UC, but is he asking the right question? I mean, he's basically saying, can you do more with less or more with what you have? But are our higher education systems really calibrated to produce the workforce we need?
Well, you know, let's step back, and I think, you know, you started the conversation with the California dream, and, you know, California is different than it was 60 years ago when you had and 50 years ago when you had a strong aerospace industry, and it's more ethnically and racially diverse. Joe talked about where he grew up. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in a steel mill town that was very racially diverse, very ethnically diverse. And, you know, we got a pretty good education out of there. But, you know, it wasn't California, and when the steel mill shut down, those people are still unemployed. And so being able to re-educate them, re-engineer your workforce is crucial to being able to match those up with the jobs, because there are people who want to be here. So one of the things we talked about, so I think this is, I'll get to it sooner rather than later, is, you know, we have been strong, my organization has been a very strong proponent of immigration reform. So California has more to win, more to gain if we get immigration reform, and more to lose if we don't. And we have employers who end up being the immigration police, but who can't legally hire people who are 3 million people who want to work, who want to be productive, who can't be as fully productive as they can be without immigration reform. And, you know, unfortunately, and this has been our mantra for 18 months, the debate in Congress is being driven by people from other states who don't have a stake in the outcome. And this is crucial, because we have a stake in the outcome, and we need to be front and center, and our congressional members need to lead the discussion on this, not let somebody else lead the discussion. And so when we come back to education for students, we also need parents to be fully employed. We need those children to be fully employed. And you know, when you have so many people in California that can't be employed by their employer to the fullest extent possible, you have a drain on the economy, you have a drag on the economy, and it may not be impacted in Palo Alto, but it certainly impacts, as I said, may not be 5 states, but it may be one of the other states in California that we need to pay attention to. And that's one of the links in the chain that is going to help bring everybody up.
Well, you know, going back to the question about, you know, we need to retrofit how we educate people from the beginning till the end. And I think that, you know, that what we have is the inability of institutions, whether it be public education, whether it be the university system, that's not willing to change. And doing more of the same isn't going to get us to where we want to go. I mean, you know, we're going to have blended education. Part of it you're using, the internet to educate. Some of it's going to be personal. We have to just totally rearrange. And change is difficult. Change is really easy when you're dictating someone else to change. But when you're saying we have to change, it's a whole different thing. So number one, we definitely need to rethink how we educate people. We need to focus on a sound basis of math, because a lot of it has to do in technology with math, and we have to do that at the beginning. So I think that the idea of, you know, sort of we will, you know, increase revenues, but we have to have accountability is absolutely the right way to go. Giving more of the same to the institutions to do the same will not get the results that we want, number one. On immigration, you know, it's an interesting thing. I think California has a lot to teach the rest of the country. And, you know, I was at Maldives during 187, and I think we learned our lesson. And as far as accepting the diversity and the value of immigration, we're ahead of the nation. And the inability of Congress to deal with the issue will dictate more and more for California to do more within its limited ability and capacity and authority. Whether it's driver's license, whether, you know, it's no longer cooperating with the rates. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that can be done. And unfortunately, you know, our legislators in Congress, the Senate, the House, aren't exactly as united and powerful. We're supposed to be the most powerful. I worked in the Senate, and I saw, you know, how our congressional delegation dealt. They couldn't even talk to each other. The North couldn't talk to the South. You know, the Inland Empire couldn't talk to whatever. Trying to get Republicans and Democrats. You know, Texans only see one color, and that's green. Money. Okay? Massachusetts only sees money. I worked for Senator Ted Kennedy, and let me tell you, he's known as a great progressive. Behind the scene, he was getting as much money to Boston, particularly to the dig, as he could possibly get. Do we do that? No. Because, you know, San Francisco gains is Los Angeles loss, and on and on. So I really think that we need to hold our elected officials accountable, and we give them a free ride. You know, and I think that one of the most damaging things that we've done in California, we've exported a lot of great stuff, but term limits is not one of them. And I think that we've lost, you know, the experience of people who really understand, you know, and could understand the complexity of governance. And in fact, what we have is this, you know, sort of kind of looking for the next position once your term in. So I really think that California is an innovative place. It's an entrepreneurial place. It attracts those type of people. We have within our capacity the ability to come to these solutions, but we're going to have to be open to change. And not just dictating change to other people, but for us to change our governance, our institutions of education, and everything that goes with it.
And John, to go back to your question about education, community colleges, CSU, UC, They're public institutions. That means by definition they have a public mission. And part of the mission has to be making sure that their graduates are ready for a 21st century California economy. We do not do the kind of job we could be doing and should be doing in making that linkage. So I think the governor is actually in a wonderful position because he has the ability to use both the carrot and the stick right now and say to UC, since that's the topic of conversation, you want to see additional funding? Then let's see some movement both in terms of what kind of education you provide and how efficiently you provide it. And that's a harder sell to make when you don't have any resources. But he's got something to bring to that conversation right now that should be a motivator. And I'll just mention, I remember in 2001, I was a freshman assembly member and I chaired the budget subcommittee on education finance. Only in a term-limited world would they say to a freshman assembly member, you should be the budget subcommittee chairman for a $50 billion a year subcommittee. Okay, fair enough. We knew then that we weren't going to have enough nurses in California. We put money into the budget for nurses. Governor Davis, line item, vetoed that money out. In fairness to the governor, he was worried about the coming economic crisis and the coming budget crisis. But then 5 years later, we all acted surprised when we had a nursing shortage. We knew then that we had a nursing shortage that was coming our way. We knew that it would cost more to provide those classes at the community college level. We put the money in the budget, it was stricken, and then we didn't have nurses. That story gets played out over and over and over again in terms of a great many essential jobs for the California economy. And, you know, with respect, and I say this as somebody with a law degree and a master's in city planning from UC, and then once I finally had enough money that I could afford to go to Stanford, I went and got a master's in international policy studies at Stanford. I value the academic environment and the academic worth of all these institutions, but there's nothing wrong with saying we also have a role here to play in a practical way in preparing the next generation for the next generation's economic challenges.
But has the California economy almost become too dynamic to really anticipate what we're going to need a generation from now? I mean, now you hear everybody talking about how young people need to learn how to code. Well, 10 years ago,
at the risk of offending my high-tech constituents, is STEM important? Science, technology, engineering, and math, is that important? Of course it is. But you know, it's also important that young people be able to read and write. And I'm looking around at the faces in this crowd, and there are enough of them who are middle-aged that, and you know who you are, you know, when you last interviewed someone for a job in your organization, and you looked at their writing sample, what did you think? Mumble, mumble, mumble. And I will tell you, John, I get young people from good universities, and I think to myself, didn't anyone stop and say, it doesn't matter how wonderful your ideas are if you can't communicate them effectively in the workplace and in the wider community. So, you know, I don't care how much the world changes in the next 5, 10, or 20 years, some of this is a level of accountability that we need to build into the system to make sure that these kids who become young adults are ready to go.
Well, you know, you talk about STEM and you talk about education and certain things, but you know, you've referenced, I think, the previous panel about a public-private partnership. You know, our children today don't get an education in civics. We look at the last election and it was the lowest turnout ever.
Yep.
And they teach civics in the second semester of the senior year in high school. So who's paying attention? And you know, the ability to, and you say, why do I bring this up on a panel about the economy? Because capitalism is dependent upon democracy. 3 branches of government. People don't understand that, don't practice that, don't understand the importance of it anymore. And so it isn't just about, I think Joe's right about reading and writing. We're also right about STEM. You're also right about analytical skills is thinking. Joe used the word think. And that's what our children need to do. But they need to understand the core principles of our checks and balances, our democracy, and how that ties into the ability to have the freedom to create capitalism and entrepreneurship. And if there's anything we can talk about in Joe's district or parts of the successful parts of California. It's that entrepreneurial spirit, that ability to think, that ability to take a risk and fail and be successful that you don't get anywhere else in the world. And that's based on our democracy. And do we teach that? Do we learn that? No. It's almost non-existent in our K-12 curriculum.
John, because we've jumped to this, I sat through the conversation, I shouldn't put that, I had the opportunity to enjoy the conversation with the assembly members. And no, and I was particularly, I mean, you know, it's having spent 12 years in the legislature and sort of listening to people who are now, you know, relatively new to the process as I was a decade ago, it's a wonderful opportunity to sort of think back. And here's what I would say. I think elected officials at every level need to do a better job of explaining in plain language why what they do has any relevance to the daily lives of the people they represent. And I think the people we represent need to be a little more aggressive about asking us in very direct language, how has your public service in Sacramento or at the Board of Supervisors made my life any better? I think it is entirely fair and appropriate, but I'll go farther and say it's necessary for the public to start to simply ask. It's a very simple question. Joe Simitian, you were in Sacramento for 12 years. Why is my life any better by virtue of the fact that you sat in that seat for 12 years? And I better have an answer. And the same now at the Board of Supervisors, where I'm a little more directly connected because my district's a little smaller. Okay, pal, you've been there for 2 years. What have you done to make my life any better? That question doesn't get asked and answered very often. And when elected officials come home and talk about, I introduced SB this and AB that, and you know, so much of the work of government is about tinkering around the edges, I'm not surprised people don't vote. They don't think it matters. And until and unless we can communicate that it matters and why it matters, I don't see the numbers changing, no matter how easy we make it for people to vote.
You know, when we look at the California economy, I think there's clearly a consensus here that education is key to training people to enter the knowledge economy. But what about those who, for whatever, by matter of interest or acumen, are really not going to be going into the knowledge economy? Those middle-class jobs have largely disappeared from California. What do we do about sustaining that level, which is really one of the divisions between the haves and the have-nots in the state?
But actually, you know, that's a misperception about, you know, that all the jobs are knowledge economy. You still need to construct houses. You need to be a welder. And the difference between a welder of 50 years ago and a welder of today is that you have to understand technology because you're dealing with technology. Even the people that clean, you know, need a sophisticated knowledge of how to work the machines, the vacuum cleaners. I mean, it's just a whole different world. We need to build houses, we need nurses, we need doctors, we need, you know, manufacturing jobs. I mean, you know, it's not all there, but all of this is based on having a level of education that allows you to participate. And California is very diverse. And, you know, the glamour the glamour of, you know, sort of Silicon Valley and now Google going into Playa del Rey, and that's really wonderful. But that's not where a lot of the jobs are. And, you know, the plumbing jobs, I mean, there's a whole bunch of jobs. That's why, to me, I think the focus in education beyond, you know, K through 12 is the community college. I want to re-emphasize that it has to be the, you know, what I call the academic with the practical. And community colleges, you know, are the key. And we have an infrastructure of community college. Every community has a community college. And either they're preparing the individual for a job, whether it be welding, plumbing, you know, the hospitality industry, or they're preparing them to transfer to a 4-year, you know, college university. So there's a lot of jobs to be had. I mean, we're all getting older. Someone's going to have to take care of us. I mean, you think about all of those jobs are necessary. So it's not for, you know, sort of lack of jobs or types of jobs. It's lack of training to do the jobs that our economy requires.
But John, if you want us to go beyond education policy, then I'll go back to two I mentioned just in passing: housing and transportation. Mm-hmm. So I live in a high-cost region of a high-cost state. And when I hold sidewalk office hours with my constituents, I literally have people either shouting at one another, or in some cases in tears, because in Mountain View, California, a decade ago, people were excited about Google. Now they see Google as the reason that their housing prices are too high. And I have a very vivid picture of one woman in particular who was in tears because she grew up in Mountain View. She was a horticulturalist. She worked at a big box store in their gardening department, and she just couldn't hang on given the rising rents. So if we're going to have people in those jobs, and if they are as essential to the economy as Antonio suggests they are, then the question is, where are they going to live? And you know, I sometimes joke that I think the next time we have an earthquake, the safest place to be is Tracy. Because as far as I can tell, every cop, firefighter, nurse, and PG&E lineman who works in my area lives in Tracy, okay? Because they can't afford to live in the region where they do their work. And so I mean it in a very serious way, which is when that quake comes, who's going to be there to take care of my folks, my constituents? And then that raises transportation questions. And this is an issue not only in terms of how Allan's folks get their products, you know, to and from market in terms of the goods movement, but it's an issue in terms of the quality of life and the productivity of the workforce if they are in fact commuting 2 hours back and forth from wherever they're able to afford a home or the rent into and out of Silicon Valley. That is time not spent with family, and it's time not spent at the desk or on the job or doing whatever it is that would make us a more productive state.
Housing is certainly an issue that has very different implications depending on where you go in the state. I mean, certainly in San Francisco, where I'm from, it is enormous in terms of everything from quality of life to the economy to be, you know, businesses being able to attract top talent from elsewhere. You have, in the previous panel, we heard Ashley Swearingen, the mayor of Fresno, talking about, you know, that they are so far out of the woods, so far not out of the woods, it's not even funny. Allan, from a statewide perspective, where does the Cal Chamber, where does housing factor in the Cal Chamber's thinking about the future of the California economy? Is it a hindrance? It certainly is in the Bay Area.
Yeah, you know, we'll come back to what is the role of government in some of these. We clearly know education. Joe mentioned transportation, you know, is clearly a role of government. And I think housing is clearly a role of government. And we used to have redevelopment zones that created funds that produced affordable housing. And we need to find a way to go back and create a fund that does that. So by way of anecdotes, so a few years ago I asked one of the defense firms, where do you get your engineers everywhere? And he said, well, you know, we might get one from Caltech and one from MIT, but the rest we get from San Jose State because they don't have to move. And they can't, the rest of the people in the country can't afford to come here. Well, I think, come back to more than one California, you know, the people from the Inland Empire in Fresno, they can't afford to move to Joe's district either. They can't afford to be an engineer there and move there. And, you know, I think that comes back to, Antonio talked a little bit about community colleges too. Most people go to school and live where they grew up in California. And it's even more restrictive because you can't afford to move to where some of these jobs are. And, you know, there are jobs available in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, that they can't fulfill, but partially housing. So I think housing, you know, there was a budget crisis. We did away with redevelopment. There were abuses with redevelopment, but I think there's a way, we have to find a way to go back and say, when you create additional taxable property because you've improved the property, can you take some of that increment and put it into some necessary programs? Might be infrastructure, and it certainly should be affordable housing. And I think that was one of the proven ways that when you did have redevelopment that worked, it worked there, and we need to, and it is a role of government, I think more so today than it has, because it is a barrier to matching up. This all comes back to, you talked about it, matching the job, the best job you can have in a state with the people who can do that job, and one of the barriers is housing.
Economists often talk about the 3 T's in the California economy, tech, trade, and tourism. And obviously, all 3 are doing quite well right now, but given that we do have these gaps in the state, do we need to diversify the state economy, and where do you see potential areas of opportunity?
Well, the state, you know, that is what California has that most other states don't have, is diversity of jobs. And when people complain about, Antonio mentioned regulations and Some people complain about taxes, and some people talk about environmental regulations. It all depends on what business you're in. And there is no one fix for everybody in California. There is no one fix for every business owner or for every company. If you're an energy industry, if you're an energy-intensive industry, you care about energy prices. If you're a labor-intensive industry, you mentioned tourism. You care about litigation and employment law and minimum wage and all those labor pressures. You know, if you're a high-tech industry, you care about a qualified workforce. You know, so every industry, there is no one fix for everybody. Don't ever look for one, one arrow in your quiver that you can shoot is going to solve the economic problems in California. And the beauty of that is we are a diverse economy, from agriculture to tourism to trade to technology to all these things, and that's good. Doesn't mean everybody doesn't have issues, doesn't have problems. Taxes may be an issue for certain industries, but there isn't one fix for everybody, and you have to look at everything based on what their cost structure is, because that's what keeps them in California.
I think the diversity, I would agree with Allan's comments about the importance of the diversity of our economy in California. I think one of the never-ending debates is about the extent to which California is or isn't business friendly. And to offer another odd analogy, I had a friend years ago who went through a painful divorce. And I asked him after the divorce, so what did you learn from all that time you spent in counseling? And he said, I learned that feelings are facts. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, whenever I'd say, how can she not acknowledge blah, 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 the counselor would say, Jack, if she feels that way, that's a fact you need to deal with. Feelings are facts. Now that came out of a marriage counselor's mouth, but I say it about the business community. If the business community feels that California is business unfriendly, then all of the statistics and data and counter arguments I can muster may not carry the day. So I do think it is important, both at the state and local level, that we communicate the value we put on good corporate citizens who create jobs, who pay taxes. I mean, I always say to the folks in my area, look, I can't tax wealth if you don't create wealth. So it's in my interest to help you create wealth. And it takes a minute before they say, yeah, I guess that means we're on the same page. But, but I mean it quite sincerely. All of the things I want to be able to deliver for the folks I represent, I can only deliver if I have resources. And I only have resources if there's a thriving economy. So I try and communicate that message. And again, some of this is real, fair enough. But a lot of it's a perception issue. And that's something we can do something about just by the way we present ourselves when we deal with the business community.
Let me put the question to Allan. Allan, what are your feelings of the Cal Chamber? Is California business unfriendly?
Once again, I think there's Joe talked about, the perception, the feelings.
Yeah.
And it depends on what industry you're in. I don't think there's any question that if you're in a labor-intensive industry, and this comes back to manufacturing, is because we certainly have, notwithstanding our comments about education, I think compared to many states in the country, we have a pretty good workforce here that, that is as educated as anywhere. And we need to do a better job to match it up. But what we have are more onerous employment laws, and I'll tell you why. And this is, hopefully Joe doesn't look at it as anything, a reflection on his days in the legislature. But with term-limited legislators, I think you see a real problem. And rather than trying to focus on a problem that's targeted towards that particular problem and trying to find a solution that only impacts them, it's easier to make it apply to everybody. And that's damaging. That's what gives us a perception of being business unfriendly. So I'll give you a good example. It was last couple years, and there are a lot of startup and businesses that don't want to comply with the employment laws in California, A, because they're too hard to learn, and B, they're just too difficult, and it's a pain in the neck, and the employees don't like them either. Well, they're the ones who will go out of business. You file a claim, the labor commissioner goes after them, She collects about 14% of the claims because they go out of business, they move, they shut down, they form another business. So rather than targeting those problems, the solution is to create a law that impacts every business. It's about joint and several liability. And that's what gives California a very difficult name, because you're in the process, you've done a good job, you try to comply with the law, and here you're hit with a law that applies, that makes you liable for somebody else's failings that you didn't want to be involved with, and you weren't the problem. And I think we go back to, how do you fix these? I think we have to make sure, and hopefully with the moderate term limits we have, the moderation where you have 12 years in either house, you can learn these issues. And when you do have a problem, let's work together, let's solve that problem. I wouldn't say there isn't a problem. I'd say the solution for some people is worse than the problem. And for other people, no. But that's the issue. Solve those problems and work together, and we should be able to be part of that discussion. And the people who aren't the problem shouldn't be tainted by that, and that's what creates the perceptions.
We want to get to audience questions, so please get your hand up and we will get a microphone to you. And while we're waiting, and Antonia, what is your perception of whether California public policy is worker friendly?
Well, it's a complicated question, but let me give you with another story. I recently had lunch with the CEO of a huge aerospace company in Southern California that moved. And I was having this conversation with this gentleman, and he said, number one, feelings are facts. So he wasn't feeling loved.
That's my point.
Because he went to that same marriage counselor.
No, but it was interesting because he said, you know what? Californians in many ways think that the weather, the environment, we're in this imperfect paradise, that's enough to hold you here. He says, elected officials never called me, never, sort of considered me important, even though I employed thousands of people. I had all these regulations. I had Governor Perry visiting me 20 times. I had Governor so-and-so, taking me out to dinner and champagne. And I said, so a little champagne convinced you to move from Southern California? And he goes, oh, well, whatever. But he wasn't feeling loved. And I think it goes to the fact, it's partly true. I mean, our tax structure needs some updating, how we tax people. I'm an attorney. I was in the business of suing businesses, okay? But I know that some regulations just don't make sense. We haven't been able to update CEQA, and God forbid should we even talk about it, okay? But it's sort of like we pass a law and it gets engraved in cement, and even though circumstances change, the law remains the same. It's this whole thing, and legislators, what are they judged for? I introduced 20 rules and 20 laws, whether you need them or not. So I think the question is, as Allan stated, we're a complex state. We have complex issues in businesses, and we need to be a little bit more attentive to the fact that we do need to compete in the world. The one thing that hasn't been said is we have a lot of opportunity in California, to really in the export business, not only with Asia, but with Latin America, with Mexico. I mean, that's a major business. We have significant port advantages, seaport advantages, that we really need to work together. And I'll give you an example. I come from Southern California. Two fantastic, fabulous ports, Long Beach, LA. Do they work together? Do they talk to one another? They compete with one another, okay? Instead of coming together, because the benefit, Long Beach is in LA County, it's not even a different county, and the benefit would be for the whole area. So I think we really need to focus on the human interaction and to see ourselves as Californians, and not Southern California, Northern California, whatever, and understand that if we lift ourselves up collectively, the California dream will become more of a reality.
Let's go to an audience question.
Hello. Can you talk a little bit more about the gerontology and the who's going to take care of us as we get age? We have the growing industry of long-term care, and there was a huge article several weeks ago about the lack of oversight on long-term care businesses and that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's an area
going to be a growth industry.
It's an area I did a little bit of work on in terms of elder protection from elder abuse, both physical abuse as well as financial abuse when I was in the legislature. I think many of you probably know far too often it is a family member or a caregiver who is actually the source of the problem, which makes it particularly painful. I do think we're going to need more oversight given the aging nature of California's population. But I'll give a nod to Alan's comments earlier. I think it's an area where you have to be thoughtful and you have to be precise. Otherwise, you're going to start to get in the way of the ability of well-intended families and caregivers to actually provide the help that's needed. So it will require something that is not a big sweeping broad brush of a regulation in my view, but something that's a little more thoughtful and a little more precise.
Another question back here? Welcome.
My question has to do with maybe perverse incentives that companies have that operate in California and the universities. And that would be, we're very happy to have Google and Apple here, but we know that a lot of their workforce comes from overseas. And so those many, many jobs are being taken by talented people who are educated elsewhere. And then in our university systems, we don't have enough courses available, for example, in computer science to train the people that Google and Facebook and Apple could really use and would prefer to hire. So what can be done, or how can this be fixed so that people who live in California, people who paid for the universities, can get a university education to get one of those good jobs?
I think it is fair to ask the question, do we need more H-1B visas because companies cannot in fact find the talent they need here? Or is it an effort to avoid paying a higher wage to homegrown talent? Fair question. That being said, I think you're spot on when you suggest that we need to do a better job of developing that homegrown talent. Now, I may have a slightly broader view than you do of what homegrown talent is, and here's where I depart from the conventional wisdom a little bit. I want the smartest minds in the country from the other 49 states and the smartest minds in the world from the other 200 countries to come to California, to go to our universities, to be educated here, and then I want them to stay here and contribute their talent, their expertise, their entrepreneurial skills, and eventually their job creation and their tax revenue to the California economy. So I think we have to be very careful about being nativist in our view of who should be resident in our California colleges and universities. I want to attract the best in the world, and then I want them to stay here and contribute to our economy. One of the few things that the president's recent action did for the high-tech world was make it easier for people who are here to stay here, to change jobs, to become a longer-term part of that economy. I think that's the key to our success, not keeping people at arm's length because we somehow feel that it's an either-or, win-lose proposition.
Joe, you know, the H-1B visa problem. You know, I think you raise a good question, but you know, the people who need that talent are going to go somewhere in the world to find that talent, and we're a lot better off if they stay here in California and bring some of that interim talent into California under a greater H-1B visa quota. And then, but you're absolutely right, that you also have to have a talent pool that's going to fill those jobs in the future with Californians and bring them here, and or take your homegrown workforce and educate them. So in the long term, they're there to fulfill those jobs. But it's not one answer, it's more than one answer to your question.
But I want us to think of those people out there in the other 49 states and in the rest of the world as future Californians. I mean, I'm about as Californian as you can get. I graduated from Pali High. I can sing you the fight song. I went to UC, I went to Stanford. But you know what? I was born in a place that's very foreign. Hackensack, New Jersey. Okay? Now, at some point, somebody probably thought I was not a Californian because I hadn't made my arrival on the scene. But I am a Californian through and through. I wouldn't live anywhere else in the world given the opportunity. And there are all of those millions of folks who have not yet been discovered by California and who California has not yet reached out to. And as I say, the sense of bringing people here, spending time and resources educating them, and then saying, please take your remarkable talent somewhere else and use it to somebody else's advantage, that is just not a sound business model for the state, and it's frankly not a value system that I would like to see us embrace or perpetuate.
Well, I agree with that. It's not an either or, it's both. But with a caveat is that our first obligation is to educate our own. And it's educate our own so they can fill those jobs and then bring that talent, because that talent's going to come. And I think the perception, once again, feelings is reality and fact, and the perception is that we're not investing in educating our own, and we're importing those people, and that we continue to have a large group of people that, if properly educated, could have filled those jobs. So it's both.
Antonia, I want to push back a little bit because I think this is a fun conversation. So the former head of MALDUF is talking about our own. How would you define our own?
Our own is the kids here who are not being educated and are not being trained to take those jobs. We are a country of immigrants. We are a state of immigrants, and that's what has made us great. But our obligation is to educate those kids, whether they are born here or whether they come here. But that is key, because the perception and the feeling is that I'm an immigrant, I wasn't born here, okay? So I'm a product in the benefit of California. But I have an obligation to educate those kids in South Central LA so they can take those jobs.
And Antonia, forgive me, but I'm going to push back and say, that sounds remarkably similar to the language I hear people use that offends my sensibilities when they talk about those people who came across the border and weren't born here. And I just think...
But see, you're misconstruing what I said, Joe. I said I welcome both, but our obligation is to educate the ones that are here. And it's educate both, you know, but the perception is that we're not educating the ones that are here. They're unemployed, unemployable, because they don't have the skills, and we're bringing individuals, and what we're setting up is a competitive situation. My thing is bring the talent, educate our talent, and then that feeling and perception of not being included will go away.
Well, in fact, it can be more than perception, since University of California had a strategy actually of increasing out-of-state residents in terms of for revenue purposes.
And I don't think using out-of-state residents or out-of-country residents for revenue generation is a public policy that I want to support. But I do want to encourage those out-of-state and out-of-country students to come here as a way to grow the California economy and create more opportunity up and down the ladder, which I think we do if we attract the best and brightest to California.
But Joe, the thing is that Cal State right now is thinking of it's entertaining of not admitting anyone from a freshman class. There are limited, unfortunately, unless the legislature and the government puts in more money, you know, there's a limited ability. And all I'm saying is, you know, we have an obligation to educate all of our kids. And if they're educated, then they're able to compete. And if they're not allowed in for lack of slots or resources, and because you're bringing in students who can pay, and it's not just from other, you know, parts of the world, it's from other, you know, out-of-state people that can afford to pay the full tuition, then, you know, what's going to happen to the kids that we're not educating?
Well, I'm going to let Allan get the
well, I'm going to point to Mark, because I think, you know, education is such a key, but I will say, having sat on a UC task force and been involved with, I'm going to be on a community college workforce task force, it's a very complicated and very political situation. And K-12 politics may be a little less complicated, but UC politics are very complicated. And Mark, your next all-day discussion ought to be identifying the problems in education, matching them up to the workforce, and solving those problems.
Let me just follow up with a quick question. I'm going to give you the last word here, Allan. Antonia had mentioned the issue of CSU talking about cutting off freshman admission. UC is looking at the prospect of a 5% tuition increase in each of the next 5 years if they don't get more money from the legislature. Each in its own way has put a gun to the head of the legislature. Do you anticipate the Cal Chamber, considering the concern that your organization has about education, are you going to be pushing for the legislature to head off those, both the tuition increase and the enrollment ceiling?
Well, I think, I'll come back to the perspective of what we started with here. It is really higher education, whether it be community colleges, and I just step back here a second. The discussion you brought in about the people that don't go to college, whether you're going to be an auto mechanic or you're going to do HVAC, you better be able to have a quality education in some of the math and science skills, because today you're not going to be competitive in those non-college job markets. So let's start there. Don't neglect those. Not everybody's going to go to a four-year institution. But community colleges, higher education, CSU, they all have funding issues. They don't have enough capacity to produce the slots for all of Californians that need to go to college. And there are a lot of the people that Antonio talks about that want to have that opportunity, that want to have that dream, and those slots aren't there for them. So you have to have resources. And I'm not going to say that UC is wrong to raise tuition, because if they don't get the money from the state, they have to find a way to fund those slots. And CSU is saying that we're going to take transfer students because we don't have enough slots. It's about hiring enough faculty. It's about making sure you have enough courses. And notwithstanding that, it really is hard for a person not to accumulate debt. When you can't graduate in 4 years, it takes you 6 years. And that's where CSU is growing. So these are issues. Can you be more efficient? I think the governor wants them all to be more efficient. That's not the easiest thing to do by just cutting off their funding, because you're a reflection of higher education in the whole country, if not the whole world. So you have to be competitive, you have to know how to do it, but they do need more resources. And I'm not going to say that if the only solution is tuition increases. Let me say, this is really, and once again back to Joe, when the economy went in the tank, no offense, when the economy went in the tank in California and we had deficits, I don't think that there was any hesitancy on some people in the legislature, may not have been Joe, and hopefully not, to not fund higher education because they could raise tuition. And many other programs that the state funds has no other revenue stream. And I think that went on for about 3 years until the consequences were horrible. Yeah. And people lamented it. So when UC tries to take the bull by the horns and say, we don't have enough resources to educate Californians, they said, it's not that we're going to do this no matter what. They said, we're going to do this if we don't get sufficient resources from the state. And as you said, it's a public institution, and they have a responsibility to be an educator, educating our children. And I think that is to fulfill the dream for those people who don't yet have it.
It's been a terrific discussion. Please join me in thanking Joe Simitian,
Thank you.
Antonia Hernández, and Allan Zaremberg